You're asleep in your shelter. It's 10,000 BC. And somewhere upstream, without any warning at all, a wall of water is already moving toward you. No sirens. No apps buzzing on a nightstand. No weather channel showing a red radar blob creeping across a map. Just the sound of water where there shouldn't be water, and by the time you hear it, you have maybe minutes to decide whether you live or die. This is the story of how ancient humans survived floods. Not with dams, not with levees, not with any of the infrastructure we take for granted today. We're talking about a species with stone tools and fire, going up against one of the most destructive forces nature has ever produced. And somehow, we're all still here to talk about it. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Flooding isn't just a disaster that happened to ancient humans occasionally. It might be one of the defining forces that shaped where we live, how we tell stories, and even how we organize society. The evidence for this is bigger than you think, and it's buried, quite literally, all over the planet. Let's start with why floods were so common in the first place. For most of human prehistory, the climate was not stable the way we imagine it. Around 11,700 years ago, the last ice age ended, and enormous ice sheets that had covered huge portions of the northern hemisphere started to melt. This wasn't a gentle thaw. It was catastrophic, sudden, and it happened over generations, not centuries. Meltwater lakes the size of countries formed behind walls of ice. When those ice dams broke, and they broke often, the water didn't trickle out. It exploded outward, carving canyons in days that would normally take a river 10,000 years to cut. Geologists studying the channeled scablands in Washington state found evidence of floods so massive they moved boulders the size of houses hundreds of miles. Early humans in these regions weren't dealing with a bad storm. They were dealing with events that reshaped entire landscapes overnight. But here's where it gets interesting. Humans didn't just survive these events by accident. They survived because they had already learned something crucial: never build your life in only one place. Hunter-gatherer societies were mobile by necessity, and that mobility turned out to be the single greatest flood survival technology anyone ever developed. If a river valley flooded, you didn't rebuild in the mud. You moved to higher ground, temporarily or permanently, and you came back when the water receded. Archaeologists studying ancient campsites along the Danube and the Rhine have found repeated layers of habitation at different elevations, evidence of populations retreating uphill during wet periods and returning to the fertile floodplain once it dried out. This wasn't panic. This was a rhythm, a pattern passed down through generations of knowledge that never got written, but got lived. Now here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. If humans were this mobile, why do we have flood myths at all? Why does nearly every culture on Earth, independently, tell a story about a flood that nearly wiped out humanity? This is where things get genuinely strange. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia around 2100 BC, describes a flood sent by the gods that covers the earth, survived by one man who builds a boat and saves his family and animals. The Hebrew Bible tells a nearly identical story with Noah. Hindu tradition tells of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before the waters rise. Chinese mythology describes Gunyu, a flood so severe it takes decades of engineering to control. Indigenous Australian, Native American, and Mesoamerican cultures all carry their own versions, completely isolated from each other, geographically and historically. Researchers have proposed for decades that these stories aren't coincidence and they aren't copied from each other. They're memory. Oral tradition encoding a real environmental catastrophe, or several catastrophes, that were significant enough to be passed down for thousands of years before anyone thought to write them. And there's a specific event that many geologists point to as a likely candidate: the flooding of the Black Sea. Around 5600 BC, as global sea levels rose after the Ice Age, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam at what's now the Bosphorus Strait, and poured into what had been a freshwater lake. Some estimates suggest the water level rose several inches per day for months, submerging thousands of square miles of previously dry, habitable land. If you were a farmer living on that lakeshore, watching your fields disappear underwater a little more each morning with no way to stop it, that's not a myth. That's a memory that would absolutely get passed down. Let's talk about the practical side, because surviving a flood isn't just about running away. It's about rebuilding afterward, and ancient humans got remarkably good at this. In Mesopotamia, communities living along the Tigris and Euphrates developed an almost paradoxical relationship with flooding. The same rivers that periodically destroyed their homes also deposited rich silt across the floodplain every single year, silt that made the soil extraordinarily fertile. Rather than fighting this cycle, early Sumerian communities built settlements on elevated mounds called tells, artificial hills constructed by literally piling up the remains of previous settlements over centuries. Each time a flood came through, people rebuilt slightly higher than before. Over generations, entire cities rose meters above the surrounding plain, not through grand engineering projects, but through the simple accumulated stubbornness of people who refused to stop living there. In ancient Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was so predictable and so essential to survival that it became the literal foundation of the calendar. Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons, and the first was Ake, the inundation. Rather than treating the flood as a disaster to escape, they built their entire agricultural and religious calendar around it. Temples included nilometers, stone structures with carved markings used to measure the exact height of the flood each year, because the difference between a good flood and a catastrophic one could mean the difference between abundance and famine. Priests would announce predicted flood levels, and the entire administrative apparatus of the state, taxation, planting schedules, labor allocation, was built around this single yearly event. This is a crucial point people miss. For many ancient civilizations, floods weren't purely a threat to survive. They were a resource to manage. The line between disaster and blessing was a matter of degree, not kind. But not every flood was manageable, and this is where the archaeology gets genuinely unsettling. In China, along the Yellow River, sediment cores taken by geologists have revealed evidence of a colossal flood dating to roughly 1920 BC, so severe that it may have contributed to the collapse of the legendary Xia dynasty and directly inspired the flood control myths surrounding the Emperor Yu, who according to legend spent 13 years away from his family, personally overseeing the construction of channels and dikes to tame the water. Whether Yu himself existed as described is debated, but the geological evidence for a flood of civilization-altering scale is not. Here's where it's worth pausing on something anthropologists have noticed across almost every flood-adapted culture in history: the survival strategy was never purely physical. It was social. Communities that survived catastrophic flooding again and again were the ones with strong systems of shared knowledge, elders who remembered where the water had reached before, oral traditions that specifically encoded warning signs, a sudden change in animal behavior, birds moving inland, a particular smell in the air upstream. This knowledge had zero value to any single individual. It only worked if it was shared, trusted, and acted on collectively, generation after generation. This is why flood myths so often come bundled with moral instruction. The story isn't just a flood happened. It's a flood happened because people had become corrupt, and one person who listened, who paid attention, who acted differently, survived. That's not superstition. That's a survival manual disguised as a story, built specifically so it would be memorable enough to survive being told around a fire for 1,000 years. And that's really the uncomfortable part of this story, because we've largely lost that system. Modern humans have flood warnings, satellite tracking, engineered levees, insurance policies. We have more technical capacity to predict and prepare for flooding than any civilization in history. And yet, according to global disaster data, flood deaths and flood-related displacement have been rising for decades, not falling. We've built enormous cities directly on floodplains, in coastal deltas, along rivers we've convinced ourselves we've tamed, because the economic value of that land was too good to pass up. Ancient Sumerians raised their cities meter by meter because they respected the water. Modern cities, in many cases, have done the opposite. We paved over wetlands that used to absorb floodwater naturally. We built permanent concrete structures where our ancestors would have simply moved. We treated a cyclical, ancient, predictable force of nature as something we could permanently override, and every few years, somewhere in the world, the water reminds us that we didn't. So how did ancient humans survive floods? Not through any single invention, but through an accumulated set of behaviors refined over hundreds of generations. Mobility, when the land demanded it. Elevation, built patiently over centuries. Calendars and rituals designed to track and respect the water's rhythm rather than fight it. And above all, shared memory, encoded in myth, passed mouth to ear around a fire in the dark, warning every generation that came after that the water always comes back, and the ones who remember are the ones who live. There's something worth sitting with here. Every culture that has ever lived beside a great river or a rising sea eventually arrived at the same conclusion independently: you don't defeat the water. You live alongside it, on its terms, and you never, ever forget what it's capable of. Somewhere right now, in an archive of oral history or a temple wall carved 4,000 years ago, that lesson is still sitting there, waiting for us to actually listen to it again.